Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. When I was growing up, psychedelics like LSD and mushrooms were considered quite taboo. Sure, they were talked about in stoner circles, but pretty much nowhere else. These days, things have changed dramatically. Psychedelics, while still illegal in most places, are being recognized for their potentially powerful role as an adjunct component to psychotherapy. There's even evidence through numerous clinical trials they can assist in the treatment of trauma, depression, and coming to terms with issues facing the end of our lives. And we're not talking about anecdotal evidence from Cheech and Chong. We are talking about credible research from internationally renowned institutions like Johns Hopkins University. Even microdosing psychedelics appear to show promising results. Yet there are a lot of mysteries surrounding this topic, and we will uncover such questions as what are psychedelics, what is microdosing, and how might it be helpful? What are the risks? I was so glad to speak with psychedelics and microdosing expert Paul Austin. Paul is the author of Mastering Microdosing, How to Use Sub-Perceptual Psychedelics to Heal Trauma, Improve Performance, and Transform Your Life. Paul's work has been featured in Forbes, Rolling Stone, and other top-shelf journals. He shares fascinating information relating to the potential benefits of psychedelics and microdosing. As always, the content on Super Psyched is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. For that, speak to your licensed medical healthcare provider. That said, please listen in as Paul and I discuss microdosing and psychedelics. Paul Austin, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to dive in.
Right on, man. It's so much fun. And I love geeking out to your work and what you're bringing to our consciousness, literally non-altered consciousness as well. But let's just go right to the beginning of things. I mean, people who meet you probably think, wow, he must have grown up on a hippie van. And your childhood was quite different from that. You came up, I believe, in a rather conservative setting, and you found your path to natural medicines on your own.
Yeah, my mom prefers the word traditional because they're Democrats, my parents, right? But religious. I spent the first 21 years of my life in West Michigan, which is a Republican stronghold, which is a traditional conservative religious stronghold. And every Sunday from the age of probably a month to the age of 18, I was at church. And so when I started to go through my own process of individuation, I had my best friend in high school happen to be an atheist, which was very rare, right? Extremely rare. But we were both independent thinkers. We met through the symphony orchestra. So I also played violin for about 12 years. And we were just kind of like a duo. And so at the age of 16, I get my driver's license. And he's like, Paul, come out to this hippie hut and let's smoke some weed. So I have my first experience with cannabis at the age of 16. It's hilarious. It's funny. It's a great time. I do it a couple more times. And then my parents find out. And they sat me down after church on a Sunday. And look, I love my parents. I have a great relationship with them. We talk almost every week. Incredible humans. And they were raised in a certain environment. And so they sit me down and my dad looks at me and he says, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 20 years ago or 25 years ago. And so that just like hit me like a ton of bricks. I walk out of the house, come back. I end up getting grounded for 4 or 5, 6 weeks, something like that. And what I learned through that experience is, okay, there's clearly a disconnect. I see these as one thing. My parents see them as completely other. These are highly stigmatized. They preferred, my mom even was like, I much would rather have you drink alcohol than smoke weed, right? Because it's more normalized. It actually, when you turn 21, it's legal. Now, of course, this is 16 years ago, right? So the whole landscape now has totally and completely changed. My dad has now done mushrooms A few years ago, I was home. He had read Michael Pollan's book and I guided him through an experience. So the landscape is totally different. At that point in time, they were still highly stigmatized. They were still highly illegal, not well understood. And so a few years later, I find myself at a Christian college, liberal arts school to where my dad taught. I had free tuition, played soccer, was in a fraternity, studied history. And in the midst of my sophomore year, I'm 19, that same friend from high school happened to be back in town, and we got some mushrooms and tried out mushrooms for the first time. And it was interesting. Like I remember it being very nostalgic. I remember laughing. We put on Pink Floyd and sort of watched that. But it wasn't like, oh my gosh, like my life has been transformed. That happened 5 months later with LSD. And so I had my first LSD experience, about 250 micrograms on the coast of Lake Michigan, these beautiful rolling sand dunes that go into the lake. It was like a beautiful early May day, mid 70s. And it really was like a before LSD and an after LSD moment. And the core thing that I learned from that experience is this importance of connection, kind of going back to what we were talking about before, the importance of being connected to nature, connected to our environment, the recognition that we are interconnected to everything around us. And also this sort of understanding that a lot of the negative emotion that I felt, a lot of the shame and the guilt that I had felt from being raised in this pretty traditional Christian upbringing, that was not mine to hold necessarily, that I could let go of that. I could release that and be free from a lot of the expectations that are often overly encumbering from our culture, from our parents, from our community, right? So there started this process of deconditioning. And in that process of deconditioning where I landed, and this is after doing acid a few more times, I probably did it 15 to 20 times over the next couple of years, was I am free to choose how I live. I am free to do whatever it is that I want. And the choice that I will make as part of that is to not spend my 20s in an office or getting a graduate degree or living any sort of conventional lifestyle. I will travel the world. I will build businesses, and I will keep sort of as my North Star sovereignty, freedom, and the capacity to create and express. And so at the age of 21, I moved to Turkey where I taught English. And then at the age of 24, this is where the story kind of comes full circle. I'm living in Budapest. I am doing acid once again, taking a couple years off, but it kind of came back into my life at a higher dose level. And I'm with a couple friends and we're just reflecting. This is 2015. We're reflecting on where is this psychedelic resurgence going? Jim Ferriss had started to publish podcasts. More and more research was coming out of Johns Hopkins and NYU. And cannabis was becoming legal in more and more states. And so our frame on it was, this has been going on for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. We tried it again in the 60s. It didn't go so well because the focus was on turn on, tune in, drop out, the counterculture, the other. Let's lead with microdosing and say, look, if this is going to become culturally integrated and acceptable, microdosing is a really great way for people to start to work with this substance or these substances in a way that it's not threatening, it's easy to engage with, and it allows them to sort of wade in the shallow end before they start to explore the deep end of their consciousness.
This is amazing. And I love the backstory. And it's particularly powerful to hear that the distance that you traveled to individuate from the system from which you came, this was not an easy bridge to cross. And you've crossed it so well that even your father was willing to bridge it and try it himself. And I'm wondering, because psychedelics are so misunderstood, whether they're MDMA, ketamine, LSD, or psilocybin, or other ayahuasca, et cetera, they're so misunderstood. Let's just start from the beginning. What is a psychedelic?
So the word psychedelic, it's made from two Greek words, psyche meaning mind and delos meaning manifesting. Now, when the Greeks thought about the mind, the psyche, they didn't think about it like we do now from sort of Descartes onwards. They thought of the mind as really the entire self, even the soul, right? There was this still spiritual element. So really it's about this soul manifestation. And that term was coined by Humphrey Osmond in a series of letters back and forth with the renowned writer Aldous Huxley. Humphrey was this kind of eccentric who lived in British Columbia, who was more or less the Johnny Appleseed of LSD in the 1950s and 60s. And Huxley, many of your listeners know Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World. Huxley was also a Vedantic philosopher. He got deep into Vedanta in the 1940s.
And then, which is the mystery which is the mystic version of Hinduism.
Correct. It's like that sort of branch or element. And then he got into mescaline and LSD in the 1950s and wrote this book called The Doors of Perception. So that is where the term comes from. Now, what is a psychedelic? A psychedelic is, I would say, classic psychedelics like LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, even something like ayahuasca, I would all consider to be the classic psychedelics. These are lysergamides. LSD is a lysergamide. Mescaline is a phenethylamine, and psilocybin is a tryptamine. So the classic psychedelics are the lysergamides, the phenethylamines, and the tryptamines. They're largely serotonergic, meaning they work on the serotonin system, which is tied into a lot of their benefits. And we can go into some of the neurobiology and what that looks like later on. However, with a sort of recent uptick of interest, MDMA is now considered a psychedelic. Ketamine, in many respects, is considered a psychedelic. And sort of this term psychedelic has expanded to include, I would say, any substance that facilitates a process of ego dissolution, that facilitates a process of deep reflection and insight. Cannabis could even be considered a psychedelic.
Right.
But what matters is the set and setting and the container that it's integrated within. So is there preparation? Is there an environment set up? Is there an intention? Is there a ritual? Is there integration done afterwards? Rather than, am I just taking a bunch of mushrooms and going to a rave? So that set and setting, that intention, that container is really key to it being a quote unquote psychedelic experience, because what it allows for is a process of surrender. And when the ego can surrender, right, through the medicine, whatever that is, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, ketamine, when the ego can surrender, all of a sudden these emotions, these stories, these narratives that we've kept locked in our subconscious and in our unconscious, the aperture of our consciousness starts to open. And so we can start to actually have a catharsis and a processing of these stories, narratives, and emotions that we've just kept repressed and tucked away for potentially years and years and years and years. And so that opening of the aperture is why psychedelics are so effective at healing the core issue, the core trauma, the core root thing, rather than just sort of a Band-Aid effect like more traditional psychiatric medications, SSRIs, SNRIs, things like that.
You know, as I hear you, I'm taking great interest in how spectacular the human brain is. It's the most complex known piece of equipment in the universe. And yet, in order for us to survive, we've had many, many problems. We have a negativity bias, which means that bad outweighs the good. We have social comparison, where we look at others and measure ourselves. We have an imaginary audience where we actually are so self-conscious about ourselves that we imagine how we are comporting ourselves in relationship with others, even if no one else is in the room. And you're talking about psychedelics as being ego dissolving, which is counter to those negative components, the side effects of owning a brain. And I've taken great interest in the concept of awe and how healing awe is. And what we've seen in brain scans is that when the brain is experiencing awe, for example, a sunset or the lunar eclipse that transpired, particularly visible in Oregon a few years back, people were basically tripping balls on awe without any exogenous outside substance. And if you look at the brain image, it was kind of an ego dissolving, very similar to being on psilocybin itself. And I was wondering if you could talk about, and this is a very long way to a ham sandwich, as often the case when I talk, but I'm thinking about the fact that there are so many misconceptions about what this is like. And you and I were talking offline about sci-fi, and a big premise of sci-fi, according to one of my soon to be coming guests, is that there is a foreign alien who comes to Earth and everybody immediately reacts with fear. We don't know what it is. We better kill it. And that our relationship with psilocybin and other hallucinogens has been similar. It's like, this is foreign, this is weird. And admittedly, the Harvard research from Tim Leary and Ram Dass, who was known then as Richard Alpert, wasn't really on point, even though they are certainly lionized for all of the awesome contributions they've made, and appropriately so, I believe. But that was not good for the evolution of our relationship with hallucinogens. But what are some of the common myths that we have about hallucinogens and psychedelics?
It's a great way to land it. I wasn't sure where we would land that. And it's like, maybe we're going to talk about the masculine versus the feminine and how...
Where's this guy going?
So, yeah. No, it's good because we get the full. And then, so common misconceptions. One is that psychedelics are like other illegal drugs. I think that's the most common one, right? Because psychedelics are Schedule 1, just like heroin, just like crystal meth. Cocaine is technically a Schedule 2, but cocaine is highly illegal and very illegal. Crack cocaine. There's this sort of sentiment that, oh, psychedelics must also be addictive. They must also be super harmful. It's good that these are illegal because if they weren't, God forbid, like the world would end or something like that. So what's interesting, if we really actually explore the history of the war on drugs and how that came about, is a lot of these drugs, particularly psychedelics, were made illegal in the late 1960s as a result of the Vietnam War movement. And there was an advisor to Nixon who said, look, we knew we couldn't make being a hippie illegal, and we knew we couldn't make being Black illegal, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah, he said this. But if we criminalize the drugs that they are using, and so at the time, Blacks were using heroin and the hippies were obviously using LSD and cannabis and mushrooms. If we criminalize the drugs that they're using, then we can basically crack down on all of this dissent and chaos that is starting to emerge. And so what was so awful about that is in the 1950s, there were over 1,000 clinical papers that were published on the efficacy of LSD in particular to treat alcoholism, addiction, anxiety. It was being hailed as the next big thing. But because of what happened in the counterculture, because of its association with the Vietnam War movement, because of its association with the counterculture, it was totally cracked down. Now, if we zoom out a little bit more, I think what was at play in an even larger context is we as a Western culture had not had a relationship in a significant way with these altered states, these states of ecstasy, since the mysteries, which were shut down by Christianity in about the 4th century. So it had been over 1,700 years since we really had this active and engaged relationship with psychedelic plant medicines. And so we weren't equipped. We had been in this industrial mindset for a few hundred years. All of a sudden, boom, LSD is dropped on the table. It blows our mind, wonder, mystery, but there has to be that container to hold the transformation, or else the volcano just destroys everything in its path, right? So that first misconception, I think, is important. The second main misconception about psychedelics is that these are just playthings for hippies, right? That these are just supposed to be used at raves and festivals, that no one serious actually works with psychedelics. And I'm sure most of your listeners probably heard a Tim Ferriss podcast or a Joe Rogan podcast, or they've now seen a research article or Michael Pollan's book or Michael Pollan's docuseries. That reframing over the last 8 years has changed tremendously, thankfully, where it's now very clear that these are tools. These are tools that, when used with intention and with responsibility, can catalyze tremendous healing and transformation. And that people from across the spectrum, not just hippies or ravers or burners, even if we're to talk about Burning Man, it's not just sort of in these very subculture things. Going back to the example of my dad has never been drunk, went to seminary, has gone to church every day, every Sunday, more or less, for his entire life. And he was willing to do mushrooms to explore his mind, to explore his consciousness, to better understand himself. And that is happening with millions of people across the globe at this point in time. And then 3, I just like to do things in 3. First wave, second wave, third wave. First myth, second myth, third myth. I think the third myth or misconception, which we can go deeper into, is that these are only tools for therapy, or that these are only tools for healing certain conditions like depression, addiction, PTSD, OCD. This whole frame of mental health and the DSM is very much a recent invention, mostly of the sort of pharmaceutical ilk. Now, the way we've been using psychedelics for thousands of years has been in ritual containers, has been through either indigenous healing, which is often healing the soul, or even in ancient Greece, it was used as a way to really connect with something much greater than ourselves. And that these deep mystical experiences and what they elicit tend to have profound benefits on the way that we relate the way we relate to ourselves, the way we relate to the earth, to our family, to our community. And that remembrance of our core as relational beings is so central then to the value shifts that people often undergo after working with psychedelics, where even if they don't have something like PTSD, depression, addiction, they can still benefit from that remembrance of, oh, I am connected with everything around me. And oh, it is important that I spend more time with my partner or spouse or my kids, or I take better care of the environment, or I have a cleaner home, a cleaner environment. All of these are slight shifts, or I'm a better communicator. I'm a more empathic listener for the company that I'm running or the business that I'm building. All of these slight shifts mean that everyone, for the most part, we can talk about exceptions to this, but everyone, for the most part, can benefit from intentional psychedelic use as long as it's done within a container, as long as it's done with intention, safety, and responsibility.
And we're going to get to the container shortly, but I've got two other possible misconceptions that the public may hold. I love the threes and I love the third wave. But let's go with this. First off, Paul Stamets, the great mycologist. For those of you who aren't familiar with him or what a mycologist is, it's a person who, in this case, has a
mushroom
PhD
expert
in the study of fungi. And he's amazing. He is the source that Michael Pollan actually tapped into in his great book on how minds change. And Paul basically had us in the palm of his hands. He said to 1,000 people, one thing that people think about psychedelics is that they might be addictive, and everyone laughed. He said, please, no, they are. No one is getting addicted to mushrooms anytime soon. And we can get into why that's the case. And the other thing is that people like Steve Jobs definitely used psychedelics, and that there does appear to be some relationship with leadership and improved leadership through judicious use of microdosing and or full doses of psychedelics. And I was wondering if you could speak to those two things, the idea that they are not addicting, and at least we have no evidence that they are, and that maybe
and leadership development
good for leadership. And just parenthetically, I remember back in the 90s, I used to sell these sound and light machines. They were these basically, you know, about these pulsing lights that you'd see in your eyes through LED lights. You'd close your eyes and then there would be accompanying rhythmic sounds, sometimes binaural beats that could change your state of mind. And I remember people go, oh, wow, that's far out. You're far out. And just the notion that if you're going to engage in the use of psychedelics, you will become so far out and unable to really relate to the world. And there does appear to be a spectacular, I mean, you can just think about meditation, and now meditation is being shown to be used by hedge fund execs to great success, and they don't become far out athletes at all. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that hodgepodge of phenomena.
Well, the addiction part is, I suppose that was even the first myth that I was getting at, that psychedelics are not like these other illegal drugs that are highly addictive, cocaine, meth, heroin, et cetera, that they work very differently from a neurobiological perspective because they're largely serotonergic agonists. They work on the serotonin system, whereas most things that are addictive work on dopamine, right? Tobacco.
And by the way, agonist means that it increases the serotonin.
It increases the serotonin availability. And what's interesting about that is 90% of our serotonin receptors are actually in the gut, right? Rather than the brain. And so what we're learning that as we learn more about the gut-brain axis, as we learn more about the vagus nerve, the reason psychedelics have a lot of the benefits they have around neuroplasticity is because they are really activating a reduction of inflammation through that relationship with the gut, which is then leading to a more sort of a plastic brain as a result of that. So, and we know that inflammation underlies almost all chronic disease. And so that's actually a really underexplored topic of research as it relates to psychedelics, is how could these be tools to help significantly reduce chronic inflammation? So that's that. When it comes to leadership, so leadership development through the judicious use of psychedelics. Well, I think first and foremost, what makes a good leader? What makes good leadership? And there's this fantastic book that for any CEOs or executives or founders who are interested in this topic, it's called Mastering Leadership. And what Mastering Leadership talks about is they have a thing called the Leadership Circle Profile. It's like a 360 assessment. And they've carried out extensive research using p-values and what's statistically significant and all those sorts of things. And what they found time and time again is the two greatest indicators for leadership success within a business environment are vision and teamwork. Vision and teamwork are the two biggest. If you can nail those two things, the likelihood of you running a really successful company goes up tremendously. And so what I usually like to explore are those two elements, right? Because one is head and one is heart. Vision is head, teamwork is heart, right? Vision is sort of the creation, the articulation, the architecture of what it is that you're doing, of what it is, your product, your service, your mission, whatever it is, clarifying that and getting as clear as possible on that. Psychedelics can help with tremendously, because when we have these higher dose psychedelic experiences, they allow us to have that 30 to 40 to 50,000 foot view. And what's really fascinating is there was a research trial done in 1966 by Dr. James Fadiman, who's like the father of modern microdosing. And in that trial, he gave 27 participants 100 micrograms of LSD. They came in because they had been stuck on a problem for 3 months. And I think out of the 27, 24, 25 of them were able to actually solve that problem and come up with an innovative solution as a result of working with the psychedelic. And the reason for that, from a neurobiologic perspective, is most drugs like caffeine and tobacco in particular, but also Adderall, amphetamines, Vyvanse, modafinil, a lot of these drugs support what is called convergent thinking. They support that process of getting, you know what you need to do, boom, 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 right? So that's
sequentially and logically and more conventionally with how we are meant to do things according to school and society.
Exactly. Whereas divergent thinking is taking things that are seemingly unrelated and looking at how we can create an innovative solution that bridges together worlds. So the example that I give with this is this third wave of psychedelics brand name movement that I came up with. We were going to third wave coffee shops, which are these sort of artisanal, like Stumptown or Intelligentsia.
It's
or
just
Blue
there over the
Bottle
weekend, man.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like artisanal coffee, single origin, like really beautiful. Those are third wave coffee shops.
Right.
So we were going to these third wave coffee shops. We were talking about psychedelics. And then all of a sudden what came up in the ether was, the third wave of psychedelics, right? It just sort of like emerged. And so that divergent thinking process, psychedelics help with tremendously, because when we take these higher doses of psychedelics, they are facilitating communication between both hemispheres of the brain. And so you brought up the example of hedge fund managers meditating. The reason that's so helpful for them is because most finance people are very rooted in the linear, rational, sort of like getting things done side. And so when we start to practice some of these contemplative practices, whether it's meditation, breath work, yoga, working with psychedelics, it creates balance because it's opening up that more creative, non-linear, non-rational side. And that balance then allows for a greater sense of presence, contentment, less rumination, less anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. And that is why these are such great tools for teamwork. Because what is so important with teamwork is to get out of the head and get into the heart. What's so important as a leader is, the vision, but then articulating and communicating that vision in a way that really resonates with your team to get their buy-in, to get them on board, to get them emotionally excited to create what it is that wants to move through. And so that teamwork and that alignment and that cohesion, when leaders really do this deeper heart work, when they can really feel into the energy, when they can really cultivate presence, then the way that they show up with their team is not so much tactical, boom, 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 boom. It's much more, it's energetic that comes in. So strategy, right? It's much more strategic because there's an energetic embodiment within that strategy where people go, I get it, I love it, and I want to be part of it, and I trust you. So trust often comes from that dropping into the heart, and psychedelics, as part of their healing and transformative potential, often help to facilitate that full process of embodiment.
And as you were describing this series of phenomena, I couldn't help but think that in many ways, psychedelics and therapy itself have so much in common. And it's no shocker that they have become kind of married through the MAPS program and through various Johns Hopkins studies. I often work with guys in their 40s or who've never done therapy in their life. They're very thinky. They've relied on logic. They've relied on convergent thinking. And therapy opens up their heart. It opens up new, to use kind of an old age and new age term chakras so that people can actually leverage more of who they actually are in a leadership position. And I will often hear that people on their team will say, yeah, you're better since what's been going on. And sometimes they'll share the secret, sometimes they won't. Sometimes I'll get a call from the wife saying, my God, I love my husband just so much more. It's often guys with whom I work, so much more. But I'm just really appreciating how the idea, a main component of divergent thinking is taking two seemingly disparate ideas and creating something new. Like the iPhone is basically taking multiple things that existed, but marrying them in a very convergent way in terms of they're converging, but in a very divergent thought process series. And I had the pleasure of interviewing Jeremy Utley, who's the dean of the School of Design at Stanford. And he said that literally no creativity occurs in a vacuum. It's taking things that exist out in nature. And one of the things that we talked about is that we have become so separate from nature itself. Mm-hmm. And that in many ways, psychedelics allow us to return to nature, to connect to ourselves, to connect to others, to connect to nature itself, almost in a very Jedi-like way that is very healthful. And if you look through the DSM, which is my Bible, according to my profession, and you look at various pathologies, they are often pathologies of disconnection. And what we're seeing with the use of, again, the judicious use, and please remember, listener, as I said in my intro, this does not constitute medical advice in any way, shape, or form. This is merely for informational purposes. I was wondering if you could speak to that idea of how these natural and sometimes synthetic psychedelics can help us become more connected to nature, to various entities within our lives.
So the classic trope that we've already discussed is hippies using acid to commune with nature, right?
Totally.
This is sort of a classic trope of the 60s. They're eating granola. They're living in communes. They have flowers in their hair, all these sorts of things. And what's interesting is when I first started working with LSD, as I mentioned, almost all of my early psychedelic experiences were with a friend or two or three or four out in the woods, sometimes for hours at a time, at the beach, in the water, just connecting and being there. And there was always something so healing about it. There was always something so it just revitalizing. It fed me in such a significant way, to such degree that those early experiences were incredibly influential in terms of my why, in terms of why I'm doing all this work with psychedelics. Because as I studied more and more, I came to recognize that the environmental crisis, for lack of a better term, is the biggest umbrella that we live within.
Sure.
Right. And that all of these other crises that we talk about, the meaning crisis, the work crisis, the mental health crisis, all of those are they're part of this larger bubble. And that malaise, that spiritual malaise that so many people experience is directly related to disconnection. Because when you can't connect with nature and the environment, you can't really connect to yourself. You can't really connect to your community. Because biologically, if we're just to go into evolutionary biology for a hot sec, right? We as humans, we lived in nature for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years if you're to go back to our ancient ancestors. So this industrial lifestyle of living in boxes, which we could also see as cages, of having artificial light, of eating processed food, of taking in chemicals and pesticides, all of this it's poison for our bodies, for our minds, and for our souls. The Japanese have invented this really cool thing called forest bathing.
Hell yeah.
Which you probably heard about. Where instead of giving you antidepressants or SSRIs, they say, go spend a day in the woods. Just spend a day in the trees, spend a day in the woods, and see how that helps. See how that helps with your chronic fatigue. See how that helps with your elevated cortisol. And what's interesting is they've done some research at Imperial College. I also started a retreat center called Synthesis in the Netherlands. We did legal psilocybin retreats where we actually did research and studies on how does psilocybin in particular help with nature connectedness, and how does that nature connectedness then relate to greater healing. And what we found is that the healing potential or the healing benefits of taking psilocybin in nature were significantly greater than just taking psilocybin in a hospital room. And so what this all points to is, how do we revive the archaic? How do we revive the primordial to weave it into a modern context where we can take the best of this first wave of psychedelics, ritual, ceremony, intention, right? And how do we combine that with this second wave of psychedelics, science, precision, right? All of the benefits of modern education, technology, and understanding. And the third wave is simply the middle way. It's the way that we bridge those two. So we come back to group work, we come back to community, we come back to doing this in nature in beautiful environments, while recognizing that we can track how does that actually impact our sleep through Oura rings? How does that impact our cortisol levels through blood work? How does that impact our relationships with our spouse and our loved ones and our family when we come back and we're not just constantly in the state of having to feel like, I gotta go, but we can actually be present. And I think presence is the greatest gift that we can give. And there's no better teacher than nature.
Totally.
On how to be present. And so when we start to work with psilocybin, with ayahuasca, with a lot of these psychedelic plant medicines, I mentioned before we went live on the show, these are almost allies on our path, and they're teachers, they're plant teachers, and they teach us presence. They teach us connection. They teach us healing. They teach us they teach us awe and mystery and wonder. And all of those are amplifications, right? Because psychedelics are also non-specific amplifiers. So when we're in nature, we're in the woods, we're experiencing this sort of slower, more grounded intelligence. We take a psychedelic and all of a sudden that becomes amplified, right? It's no coincidence that a common cliche is I took acid and now I know why I love to hug trees, or I took acid and now I know why I'm connected to all of the nature around me. Because when you have this deep experience and you're surrounded by woods or the beach or nature, there's an indescribable feeling of connection to everything around you that previously we're just too shut off. We're too in our cages. We're too in our constricted worldviews to sort of experience that magic, if you will.
Dude, 100%. As you're describing this, I'm thinking about the often satirized YouTube meme of the guy tripping on the double rainbow. And I love the double rainbow guy. I was like, right on, dude. You're connected. That's beautiful. And everybody else was like, oh, he's so lame. Or that's so stupid. And even South Park kind of tripped on it. And I love Train Matt. I love South Park. I'm not ragging on them, but it got into that level. Back to rainbows. This is not all rainbows and unicorn. This is an exogenous series of substances, things that can go wrong when not taken appropriately or with the right people or with the wrong intentions. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the things that people should look out for and like what could be some of the downsides to engaging in psychedelics. Yeah, what should people be aware of and wary of?
Yeah, cautions, risks, downsides. I think the first one is these are, as you've already mentioned, these are illegal basically everywhere still. Now, what's interesting is Oregon recently legalized psilocybin. Colorado recently legalized all plant medicine. The Netherlands and Jamaica have legal psilocybin, and ayahuasca, San Pedro, some of these other indigenous plant medicines are legal in certain places in Central and South America. But by and large, these are Schedule 1, highly illegal substances. And that is, in fact, the most dangerous part about psychedelics is that they're illegal. Now, quick caveat, the DEA doesn't really care about psychedelics at this point in time. They're really focused on fentanyl, cocaine, opiates, much harder drugs, much more dangerous drugs that are tied to organized crime, overdoses, deaths, things like that. But they're still illegal. There are still people who get arrested. And so that is really important to keep in mind as part of this path. Now, on Third Wave, which we can point to links afterwards at the end, we do have a sourcing guide in which we help people navigate the legal landscape. We also have a mushroom grow kit if people wish to grow their own mushrooms, because a kit isn't illegal, spores aren't illegal. And in many jurisdictions now, growing your own mushrooms is not illegal. The act of selling is, though, just so folks know. That's important to emphasize. So the legal landscape is number one. Number two, those who have a family history or predisposition to psychosis or personality disorder or schizophrenia should not be engaging with psychedelic use, especially if they're under the age of 26, because that's usually by that point in time is when schizophrenia or psychosis present itself. So if you have a family history and you're over the age of 26, you should be extremely careful. And my advice would be to not even engage whatsoever. There are other ways to facilitate states of ecstasy or altered states, including breath and float tanks that are non-exogenous. that are endogenous that I think are better tools to maybe do this inner work for those who might have a family history of psychosis.
If I can just break in, I have clinically and have understood that psychotic breaks can even occur in as late as the 30s. But
that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Great little ad there.
A little add in.
Thanks for the correction. So into your 30s, even, it's important. So, and I think the third caution or risk to be aware of is be very mindful and intentional if you do choose to work with psychedelics about who you're choosing to work with. And so at Third Wave, we have a directory of vetted providers, retreats, clinics, therapists, and coaches. As part of our ecosystem that we're building, we also have a training program for coaches. So if you are a coach, a practitioner, a healer, and you're interested in working with psychedelics, that's all on Third Wave. And we're training those coaches because we think it's critically important that there is a trained and educated group of practitioners and facilitators who can be the front lines for all of this work. Because the biggest potential risk, we've talked about legality, we've talked about psychosis, but the biggest potential risk is unethical, unsavory, unqualified guides, therapists, facilitators, people who are presenting themselves as X, but aren't really people of integrity, right? And so I think that is, because what that leads to is, this isn't a matter of 51% of people have to have great psychedelic experiences if we're to have legal access. This is a matter of, even if there are 10 million people having great experiences, but only 100 people who are having really awful and negative experiences because of unethical providers or poor education, the tail risk of this is significant because of how volcanic these states of ecstasy can become. And I think this is where, again, I talk about the third wave. This is the role of technology, is that now more than ever, we can utilize technology to create algorithms and systems of vetting to ensure that these providers who are amplified are actually legit. And that's a lot of the groundwork that we're doing now through Third Wave, is to bring people a trusted, vetted, verified provider or network of providers.
I love that. And one of the things, I take supplements myself. I think it's one of the biggest industries going on. One of the problems and one of the strengths of supplements is that they are not FDA approved. And there are certain bodies like consumer labs, I have no affiliation with them, where to my knowledge, they actually scrutinize the legitimacy of these non-regulated supplements. And similarly, we're kind of in the Wild West right now. And I wonder also about bad trips and flashbacks, which are not uncommon, particularly when done in the wrong hands. I'm wondering if you talk about those two things.
So bad trips, we also call challenging experiences.
Not euphemistically?
Euphemistically. In that, like, bad trips and flashbacks, we'll just focus on those. Those are often a result of polydrug use, meaning the individual is not only doing mushrooms, but they're also drinking alcohol, they're also smoking weed, they're also maybe on amphetamines, right? Like, there's usually a lot of other things going on for something like, the technical term for flashbacks is HPPD. So that's the technical term for flashbacks. And that usually happens at a younger age, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, like adolescence, late teens, early 20s, from polydrug use in unsafe containers and unsafe environments. Same with bad trips. The classic, I've even had my fair share of bad trips, and it's always because I wasn't intentional enough about the container that I was taking them in. And paranoia is usually the biggest thing from that. Because I have had these experiences where I think I'm dead. This happened a couple of years ago. I call my mom. I'm like, Mom, I'm dead. She goes, Paul, I'm talking with you. What are you talking about? My friend had to take the phone and be like, Paul's fine. He just took too much mushrooms. And we were at this park in Miami, Botanical Garden. So bad trips, the sort of underlying thing is paranoia. And how we address that is we ensure there's preparation. We ensure, again, go back to that word container. There's a set and setting where you feel safe, where you feel comfortable, that especially if it's your first time, you're not necessarily trying to like blast off and take as much as possible, that you maybe start to wade in and take 1 gram. And then the next time, maybe take 2 grams. And then the next time, maybe take 3 grams, just slightly titrate up rather than feeling like you have to jump in the deep end right away. And that actually, kind of to speak to the challenging experiences part, oftentimes in psychedelic experiences, even if there's a great set and setting, there's a great container, there's preparation, a core reason these substances are so healing is because of catharsis and the confrontation of the shadow. And so when we've had, like for someone who's struggling with depression, if they have a traumatic experience that they've gone through and they've just kept it repressed, psychedelics will often bring that to the surface for them to face. And there will have to be a release of sadness, of anger, of grief. There will be all these negative emotions that come up.
So and shadow work almost.
Yeah. And that catharsis is why psychedelics heal the root cause, because they actually allow for the release of all of this unprocessed trauma and material. And in releasing it, there's actually a capacity to then integrate it. But if it's stuck inside, if it's a sort of a diseased part of yourself, a disconnected part of yourself, a part of yourself that you've exiled, then that will always continue to sort of haunt you and affect you. Better to welcome it back in, to love it, to integrate it so you can become a more whole being. And that's where psychedelics, and that's, I think, the key as to why psychedelics are such efficacious tools.
And I love the fact that you're talking about us as multiplicities, that we have various parts, including exiled parts within ourselves, and that the psychedelics can help move those exiled parts, that they will be there, whether we like it or not, in as much as sorry folks, a little trigger word alert for gross pussy cavity or something that is festering will not go away. Well, it can go away on its own, but oftentimes can be assisted by being expressed. I see therapy and the use of psychedelics based on your description as very similar as a moving mechanism. You've even talked about BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, and how this can help us accelerate neurogenesis and growing new parts of our brain. I mean, there's just so many interesting facets to this study. That said, because you've written the book on microdosing, I got to get into that for a sec. What is microdosing and why might it be of interest to the listener?
So microdosing is pretty novel and new. In many ways, again, we've been doing it for potentially thousands of years, but as a concept, it only really came on the scene in 2011. Dr. Jim Fadiman, who we've mentioned before, was on the Tim Ferriss podcast, 2015, talked about microdosing, noticed that a lot of folks were using microdosing anecdotally to help with energy levels, to help with having a better mood, to be slightly more creative, to get into more flow. And the whole idea around microdosing is that it's not a dose level that you're taking where you're having visuals and, you're going into this deep space and, you're having the mystical experience. It's what Jim called at that time a sub-perceptual dose of a psychedelic, about a tenth of a regular dose. So for LSD, what I would call a microdose is anywhere from 5 to 30 micrograms. With psilocybin, it'd be anywhere from 50 to probably 350 milligrams. And in talking with Paul Stamets, I interviewed Paul for the podcast about 5 months ago, who's already come up. He reframed microdosing as, instead of sub-perceptual, sub-intoxicating. So, because a lot of people, when they microdose, get hung up on, am I feeling this? Am I not feeling this? Am I feeling this? Am I not feeling this? Am I doing this correctly? So that reframe of sub-intoxicating means it's a dose level that you can still navigate your everyday reality. You might feel a little something. You might feel a little bit more euphoric. You might feel more emotions, right? You might feel a little more sensitive. And it's all personal to you because you and your physiology and your neurology is unique compared to X, Y, and Z other person. Two other things that are important to emphasize with microdosing. One is that microdosing initially should be done as a protocol, where instead of just taking a low dose once and going, did I feel it? Did I not feel it? You're really looking at, how do I take a microdose 2 to 3 times per week for anywhere from a month to 2 months? And you're looking at the subjective changes from day 1 to day 30 or day 1 to day 60. So just like you don't sit down on the cushion and meditate for 15 minutes, and day 1, you're like, oh, I'm less reactive. Everything is beautiful, present. No, when you meditate and you're expecting to see some sort of subjective benefit, you do it for 30 days straight, or you do it for 60 days straight, whatever that is. Then you go, oh, I can see now how much I'm less reactive. I'm more emotionally regulated. I'm more present. There's less rumination. And microdosing is very similar in that it really takes that commitment to a longer protocol and longer process. The last thing that I'll emphasize that I think is important is that microdosing is not a magic pill. So I think the shadow side or some of the risks of microdosing is that, especially for people who have struggled with depression or anxiety or have been on SSRIs and they finally have found something that works, there is a pretty ingrained belief that they got to keep taking it in order to feel good. And I think what's important to remember is that psychedelics, microdosing, they are catalysts, they are openers, they help with neuroplasticity. And the whole point of working with psychedelics is to make substantive and integral changes that help you after the fact, right? To your diet, to your sleep, to your contemplative practices, to your relationship, right? Psychedelics help facilitate awareness, right? They can also help to facilitate courage to make difficult changes. But at the end of the day, you still have to make those changes. You still have to participate in your life. You still have to be the sovereign creator that you are. And microdosing and even higher doses of psychedelics simply help you in that process, but they are not the thing itself. The metaphor that I'll often teach about is Dumbo the elephant. When Dumbo learned to fly, he thought it was because he had a feather, that he had to have that feather in order to fly. And then the feather was taken away, and Dumbo realized that he had that power inside of him all along. And I think microdosing or even psychedelics are the feather. They are the reminder. They are sometimes the catalyst, but they are not the thing itself. You are the thing itself, and psychedelics are simply the reminder of your power.
And as you're describing this, I often think about when therapy is aided by psychotropic medication, that is, our commonly prescribed medications from physicians. And oftentimes I say it kind of serves as a tool. You still need to know how to use the tool, but it makes the process easier for various repairs and fixes while you're learning these new skills in life. Like for me, ADHD, I was supremely helped by the use of stimulants as I was trying to learn new skills for a number of years as I put myself through what I refer to as Navy SEALs, my own self-created Navy SEALs boot camp, so I could not have to rely on the meds anymore. And lo and behold, I didn't. And for many people, they're able to use these medications judiciously for a period of time. And it sounds like psychedelics are somewhat similar. They are also similar in that they require repeated use. And I think of kind of with meditation, teacher once told me, it's kind of like tissue paper. In and of itself, it weighs nothing. It seems porous, but if you get me 100 sheets of tissue paper, suddenly it becomes weighty and thick and strong. And that's the meditative kind of progression over the long game, similar to what you were describing of microdosing.
Yeah, one key distinction here that I just want to come back. I know we've already talked about it, but it's worth emphasizing here.
Sure.
SSRIs, SNRIs, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics. If you stop taking those, as you mentioned, it's hell. There's significant withdrawal symptoms. There can be significant issues and challenges. So one thing, if anyone is listening to this who's potentially interested in this, always do so under the guidance of a medical professional,
100%.
of a licensed psychiatrist, right? Always have that support. This isn't, for me, I'm not bashing SSRIs and SNRIs and all these things are always bad. Sometimes they're necessary and helpful. And what's beautiful about microdosing is even if you stop microdosing, there will be no withdrawals, right? These are not addictive substances. People will notice if they have been microdosing and they stop, they may notice some symptoms start to come back, but they're not going to have these hellish withdrawals like they would with SSRIs or benzodiazepines. So I think that's just an important aspect to emphasize with this topic.
So let's talk about training for a second, pivot to that. What does a well-trained guide look like? What type of education goes to somebody who's going to be assisting people on their journeys? And by the way, I just need to say, you and I are both very seasoned world travelers. And one of the ways that my brain has become fortified, and I know yours has too, is through the acquisition of experiences through international travel and challenging myself by merging with cultures that are very different from my own, which have actually caused various brain openings that I can only imagine if I had the luxury of a brain imaging system on me. I imagine that many of the processes when I was seeing Japan for the very first time and becoming as Japanese as I could become as a Westerner, that there were probably similar processes to tripping on. That's the verb that's often used for. So I just couldn't help but think this is a form of internal travel that can incur perhaps similar outcomes.
Well, Huxley, back to Aldous Huxley, our good friend and pioneer, would talk about how we as humans have, for the most part, explored the external mind, the world around us, right? Through industrialism, through colonialism, through travel, through airplanes now. The territory to now explore is the inner antipodes of the mind. And that's what psychedelics.
I'm sorry, I need to throw something out here because it's so on point. The man who discovered the Titanic, he was talking about the budget of sea exploration versus space exploration. Space exploration, to your point, has 1,000x budget compared to monitoring our seas, which probably have the cures to cancer somewhere down there. naturally, as it's been so unexplored. Similarly, we like to do like, I want to work out the gym and work on my biceps and my pecs. Well, therapy is a similar process. It's just not as sexy on the outside world. Rather than going external, you're going internal. And most of us love the external. If you look at what people will spend, even if their budgets suck, they will spend all their money and money they don't even have on plastic surgery, but they might not do so for therapy. So it's just interesting.
That's a great point. It's that masculine, feminine. We're very driven towards the light, the growth, and all that. Whereas the feminine, the dark, the watery, the like all that is, it's a little murky.
We were more yang versus yin oriented.
Right. Exactly.
And you're really speaking on behalf of the yin, almost like the Lorax on behalf of the trees.
Exactly. I love that. I love Dr. Seuss. So quick, we'll get into like guide, right? So I think of it in terms of 5 steps that a guide should bring you through. Assessment. There should always be an assessment. Who are you? What's your background? What's your experience with contemplative practices? What's your experience with psychedelics? Do you have any history of adverse childhood experiences? What are your other traumatic experiences? Are you on any psychiatric medications? There should always be an assessment. Right. So they have a sense of who you are, right? Intake form. Next is preparation. There should always be calls that are set up to help you prepare for the experience. The obviously big element is holding space, the experience itself. And usually the key indicator for that I talk about is, do you know this person? Have you had a friend who has sat with this person? Do you have someone you trust who has sat with this person? Or did you just sort of find them randomly through whatever means? So I think that experiential, like it's ideal to have someone, to work with someone who you know you can trust because they are recommended or curated through a person or an organization that you trust. Assessment, prep, holding space, integration. Are they going to offer integration support, or are you just sort of done once you finish? And then do they know anything about microdosing as a tool for integration? So I would ask about those 5 things: assessment, prep, holding space, integration, microdosing. That'll cover most of what you need to cover. In terms of certifications, look, there are some phenomenal underground guides who have been doing this for 30 years who will never get a certification because there's no need. And there are people who have gotten certifications from the best institutions who have no business facilitating experiences whatsoever. So a lot of that is like I said, a friend. Yes. There are some great programs out there. MAPS is training a lot of therapists for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. The California Institute of Integral Studies, CIIS, is training a lot of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapists. As I mentioned, we have a training program that's more for coaches around assessment, prep, integration, and microdosing. But at the end of the day, talk with the person, get them on Zoom if you can meet them in real life, and get a gut check. Trust your intuition, get a sense of who they are, and get referrals and recommendations as much as possible.
Paul, this has been so much fun being with you. And I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for sharing your hard-earned wisdom, maybe even pleasurably earned wisdom, but some of it must have been also hard, including dying and calling your mom. And this has just been phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adam. This has been an honor today to sit with you and just to tell your audience a little bit about what's going on in the psychedelic landscape. And I can't wait for more. So thanks again.
Right on. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.